The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the western horizon when Silas Granger rode into the dusty settlement of Dry Creek. His horse, a rugged chestnut stallion with a coat the color of burnished copper, kicked up clouds of sand with each deliberate step. Silas was a man of few words, a figure carved from the harsh landscape itself, with a jaw like weathered stone and eyes that seemed to weigh a person's soul in a single glance. The townsfolk, accustomed to the harshness of frontier life, glanced nervously at him as he passed, whispering among themselves about the man who owned the vast Granger Ranch, just beyond the hills, a ranch that seemed to stretch further than the eye could see, where cattle grazed under the endless sky and the wind carried secrets of 1,000 untold stories. But that morning, Silas Granger's mind was not on cattle or the rustle of the prairie. His gaze, sharp and calculating, was fixed on the auction block at the center of town. The wooden platform looked ordinary enough to the casual observer, worn and sun-bleached, but for Silas it held a promise. He dismounted and let his spurred boots thud against the hard-packed dirt, drawing the attention of every settler and drifter who had gathered. A man who could bend the wild land to his will, yet who moved with the careful patience of someone who had survived 1,000 storms. On the platform, amidst the clamor of haggling voices and the clang of gavel strikes, stood a girl no older than 16. Her eyes were wide and alert, glimmering with a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, framing a face delicate yet unbowed by hardship. Dave. The murmurs of the crowd hinted at her story, an orphan brought far from lands she could barely remember, sold at auction to strangers who saw her only as a commodity. But Silas saw something else. He saw a spirit that refused to break, a strength hidden beneath quiet caution, and in that moment he made a decision that would defy every expectation in Dry Creek. $3. The sum was almost laughable, barely enough to buy a dozen rounds of ammunition or a pair of new boots. And yet Silas pressed the silver coins into the auctioneer's hand. His grip steady, eyes locked on the girl whose fate had suddenly shifted without her understanding. The murmurs around the crowd grew louder, half disbelief and half curiosity. Who was this man who would spend so little on something or someone so seemingly valuable, and more so, who would then offer her something unimaginable? By the time the auction ended, the sun had climbed high, casting sharp shadows across the dusty street. Silas approached the girl, his expression unreadable. She looked at him with caution, every instinct telling her to flee, to hide, to distrust. Yet there was something in the way he extended his hand, not in command, but in quiet assurance, that caused her to hesitate. The crowd parted, sensing that they were about to witness the unusual unfolding of a story that would ripple through their town for years to come. "Your name?" Silas asked, voice low and deliberate, carrying across the thin space between them. She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper in the dry air. "Maylin," she said. Silas nodded, as though weighing the weight of the world on a single word. "Maylin, come with me. The ranch is waiting." The journey to Granger Ranch was long and silent, with the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. Maylin rode cautiously, as if any sudden movement might tip the balance of her new reality. Silas, as ever, remained silent, letting the landscape itself speak the language of the west-wide skies, endless plains, and the faint promise of danger that always seemed to linger beyond the hills. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and crimson. The house, sturdy and weather-beaten, stood like a sentinel at the heart of the sprawling property. Cattle lowed in the distance, and the occasional creak of the windmill punctuated the quiet. Silas dismounted and gestured for Maylin to follow. "This is yours now," he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and yet Maylin could not comprehend them fully. She had expected harsh treatment, maybe even cruelty, and instead, she was met with a gift that defied every lesson life had taught her. That night, as the stars began to pierce the velvet darkness, the ranch seemed alive with whispers. The wind through the open windows carried the scent of hay and earth, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, as if acknowledging the unlikeliest of arrangements. Maylin sat on the edge of her new room, staring at the horizon, trying to make sense of the strange, immense land now under her name. And Silas? He watched from the porch, a figure carved in shadow, silent but alert, as though guarding against a threat no one else could see. For in Dry Creek, rumors traveled faster than the wind, and news of a rancher giving away a ranch to a girl bought for $3 would not go unnoticed. Some whispered admiration, others suspicion, and a few muttered about old scores yet unpaid. Silas knew it, as did Mei Lin, in some instinctive, unnamed way. The generosity of a man like Silas Granger was never simple, never without consequence. And the night carried a sense of waiting, a tension that neither could shake. As the moon climbed higher, shadows stretched across the land like fingers reaching for secrets. Mei Lin felt a quiet unease, a knowing that her new life was only the beginning of something far larger, far more dangerous and far more extraordinary than she could yet imagine. And Silas, standing by the fence, gazed out over the rolling plains, sensing the stirrings of forces that had been long dormant. Forces that would test courage, loyalty, and the strength of the bond between an unlikely protector and the girl who had become the unexpected heir of the Granger legacy. Somewhere beyond the hills, the distant sound of hooves echoed faintly in the night. A reminder that the frontier never slept, and that Dry Creek had already begun to shift in ways neither of them could control. The story of a rancher who bought a girl for $3 and gave her a ranch was only beginning. And the questions hung thick in the desert air, questions about trust, survival, and a destiny neither of them had yet dared to face. By the first light of dawn, the ranch would be awake with the usual bustle of chores, the lowing of cattle, and the creak of weathered wood. But the winds of change had arrived with the night, carrying promises, dangers, and a story that would challenge everything the frontier had ever known. Mei Lin, once a girl sold as property, now held the fate of a sprawling empire in her hands. And Silas Granger, the man who understood the unforgiving law of the West, knew the quiet truth no good deed ever goes unnoticed. And in a land ruled by grit and courage, the smallest act could awaken the fiercest storms. The ranch lay under the first pale light, quiet yet alive, as if it were holding its breath. And somewhere on the horizon, a shadow moved silent, deliberate, watching. The story of Mei Lin and Silas Granger was just beginning, and Dry Creek would never be the same. The next morning, the ranch awoke under a pale, cautious sun. The wind swept across the plains, lifting dust into thin spirals that danced lazily over the grazing cattle. Mei Lin watched from the porch as Silas moved through the yard, a figure at once commanding and unassuming. He worked without hurry, tending to fences, checking the stock, and occasionally glancing toward the distant hills, as if reading secrets hidden in the shadows. There was an unspoken rhythm to his day, a life carved by discipline and solitude. Mei Lin found herself drawn to it, though she could not yet put words to the feeling. It was a strange mixture of awe and fear, comfort and unease. Silas did not speak much, and when he did, his words were deliberate, weighted with experience. "This land," he said one morning as he handed her a worn leather saddle, "doesn't give second chances. You have to respect it, or it will humble you in ways you won't forget." Mei Lin nodded, gripping the saddle tightly, though she barely understood what he meant. The ranch was vast, intimidating, alive with the pulse of the untamed West. Even the simplest tasks, feeding the cattle, checking the corral, hauling water, felt like tests, each one a lesson in patience and survival. At night, the ranch seemed to change. The wind grew louder, carrying strange sounds across the prairie. Coyotes howled in the distance, and the wooden beams of the house creaked like old bones under the weight of the dark. Mei Lin would often sit by the window, staring at the endless sky, the unfamiliar constellations blinking down at her. She thought of the journey that had brought her here from a crowded town full of strangers to this lonely expanse of land, and wondered how a life so small and constrained could suddenly be tied to something so enormous and unpredictable. Silas, for his part, seemed to carry the weight of secrets heavier than the sun-baked earth itself. Occasionally he would pause while working and stare off toward the horizon, as though seeing something invisible to everyone else. When Mei Lin asked about the distant hills, he would shrug, eyes narrowing. "The land holds stories," he said. "Some you'll never hear. Some are better left alone." Those words lingered long after he had spoken them, leaving a strange ache in her chest. Mei Lin began to sense that the ranch was more than a gift. It was a responsibility, a puzzle wrapped in dust and wind, and she was now a part of it whether she wanted to be or not. One evening, a rider appeared on the ridge, moving slowly along the jagged trail that led down into the valley. Silas noticed him before Mei Lin did, his posture rigid, hand resting near the butt of his revolver. The rider's approach was deliberate, cautious, like someone who knew the dangers of a land that had no patience for mistakes. When the man drew closer, his face came into view. Sharp features, eyes dark and calculating, a coat that had seen too many storms. Silas did not speak immediately. Instead, he watched, letting the tension build until the rider stopped at the edge of the ranch. "Silas Granger," the man said finally, voice smooth, yet edged with something dangerous. "I hear you've taken in a girl from the auction. Maylin, isn't it?" His gaze flicked to Maylin, and she shrank back slightly, unsure how to respond. Silas's eyes narrowed, calculating. "That's right," he said quietly. "She's under my protection." The stranger's lips curved into a thin, unreadable smile. "Protection is costly in these parts, Granger. And some debts," he said, glancing toward the distant hills, "have a way of coming due, no matter how well you hide." With that, he spurred his horse and disappeared down the trail, leaving only dust and a sense of foreboding in his wake. Maylin felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Silas said nothing for a long moment, only tightening his jaw, the lines on his face deepening as if the wind itself had carved them there. That night, the unease lingered like smoke over the ranch. Maylin could not sleep. She wandered through the yard, the fence posts casting long shadows under the moonlight. Somewhere beyond the hills, she imagined eyes watching, waiting. Silas, she realized, was not just protecting her from strangers in town. He was guarding her from the unseen dangers that stalked the land itself, threats shaped by history, rivalry, and old grudges that refused to die. Over the following weeks, Maylin began to learn the rhythms of ranch life. She rode with Silas, learning to guide the horses through rocky passes and across dry riverbeds. She learned to mend fences, tend the cattle, and even handle the occasional rattlesnake that crossed their path. Yet for all her growing skill, there was a persistent shadow over the ranch. A quiet tension that whispered in the wind and rustled through the tall prairie grass. Something she sensed was coming. Something that would test both her courage and Silas's resolve. Silas, though stern, began to share fragments of his past. He spoke of years spent tracking outlaws across the plains, of storms that could kill a man as easily as a bullet, and of rival ranchers whose jealousy often turned to violence. Maylin listened, absorbing every story, feeling the weight of a life shaped by danger and survival. She began to understand why he had taken her in, why he had given her something so valuable. Light was not just generosity. It was strategy, protection, and a recognition that the world could be merciless, especially to those who had no one to watch their back. But the more Maylin learned, the more questions she had. Why her? Why now? What had Silas seen in her that no one else had? And perhaps most unnerving of all, what was the price for a gift as immense as a ranch? The land itself seemed to hum with quiet warnings. Wildfires, cattle rustlers, and storms were dangers enough, but there was something else, something human. Rivals who watched from afar. Men who measured courage and weakness with the same cold eye. The kind of men who would cross lines most considered sacred. One evening, while inspecting the far edge of the property, Lynn discovered a trail she had not noticed before. Narrow path winding up toward the cliffs. Curious, she followed it, her boots crunching against the loose stones. The trail ended at a cave hidden among scrub and rock. Inside, she found signs of someone having been there recently. Footprints, a discarded piece of cloth, and faint scorch marks where a fire had been. She froze, realizing that the ranch's secrets might stretch further than she could see. And in that moment she understood something essential. The gift of a ranch came with chains of its own, invisible yet binding, and those chains were only beginning to reveal themselves. When she returned, Silas was waiting, leaning against the porch railing, eyes fixed on the western hills. I said nothing at first, simply watching her approach. Finally he spoke, voice low and measured. "The land has eyes, Maylin," he said. "Sometimes the past rides faster than the present. You'll learn that soon enough." Maylin could sense the urgency in his tone, the quiet warning behind his calm exterior. She nodded, though she did not fully understand. Every day at the ranch brought new lessons, new challenges, and the relentless sense that something was moving in the shadows, an unknown force. Patient and deliberate, waiting for the right moment. Even as she settled into her routines, the wind across the prairie seemed to carry whispers. Neighbors in Dry Creek watched from a distance, curious and cautious. Some envied Silas's wealth, some distrusted his motives, and a few muttered of old scores yet to be paid. Rumors, like wildfire, began to spread beyond the hills, reaching ears that had long memories and little mercy. Maylin realized that her life, once quiet and unremarkable, had been thrown into a story much larger than herself, a story that would test her courage, her loyalty, and her ability to survive in a land that demanded strength at every turn. The ranch stretched out beneath the endless sky, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. In the distance, beyond the hills that seemed to guard the horizon, Maylin and Silas knew that unseen eyes were watching, waiting. The story of the girl bought for $3, and the rancher who had given her a world she could not yet comprehend, was far from over. The real journey, the tests, the dangers, the choices that would define both of them, had only just begun. The days at Granger Ranch grew longer and heavier as the season shifted toward late summer. The sun scorched the earth with relentless heat, and the prairie grasses rustled dry and brittle beneath the wind. Maylin had learned much since the auction: how to ride, how to mend fences, how to read the moods of horses. But the lessons Silas had hinted at, the ones that weighed on the land itself, remained elusive. There was a tension that seemed to hang over every ridge, a quiet warning that the past and the present were converging with a purpose neither of them could yet name. Word of the ranch and its unusual new owner spread fast through Dry Creek. Some townsfolk whispered about Silas's generosity, impressed by his decision to give a girl a life far beyond her means. Others muttered darkly, warning Maylin that nothing in the West came without a price. There were even those who said the girl was a mark, a pawn in a larger game of power and revenge. Maylin could feel their eyes on her when she ventured into town, the suspicion and curiosity burning like a quiet fire. Even small gestures, a nod, a glance, a passing smile, were measured, weighed, and judged. It was during one of these trips that she first noticed the man who would come to define a shadow over her new life. His name, she would later learn, was Yarrick Kincaid, a rancher from beyond the Western Divide. He was broad-shouldered, with a face carved from years of harsh sun and battle, eyes like cold steel that measured every person he met. He approached Dry Creek with the confidence of someone who believed the land and everyone on it could be bent to his will. Rumors said he had lost family to rustlers and frontier feuds, and he carried grudges like weapons, sharp and unyielding. When Maylin first caught sight of him in the town square, standing with his hands tucked into leather gloves and jaw clenched, she felt the air tighten. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Silas moved with the vigilance of a man accustomed to threats both seen and unseen. He knew the land, its hidden trails, and the hills where danger could gather unnoticed. And though he rarely spoke of it, there were nights when he would ride out alone, scouting the borders of his property, checking for signs of rustlers or strangers who lingered too long. Maylin often followed from a distance, hidden in the shadows, learning to sense the movements of men like her protector. But every ride, every glimpse of the horizon, reminded her that the ranch was not merely a gift, it was a stage on which dangers were already taking shape. The first real sign of trouble came in the form of a fire. It started at the edge of the southern pasture, smoke curling into the sky like a warning banner. Maylin saw it first, a faint glow among the dry grasses, and shouted for Silas. By the time he arrived, flames had grown, licking at the fence posts and sending cattle stampeding in panic. They fought the fire together, bucket by bucket, hose by hose, until the danger passed. But even as the last ember died under their efforts, Silas's face remained grave, unrelieved by victory. "Someone started this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They're testing us." Over the following days, small acts of sabotage continued. Tools went missing, fences were cut, and there were even threats left pinned to the barn doors, messages written in crude, looping letters that carried more menace than words alone. Maylin began to understand that the auction, the gift of the ranch, and the attention of strangers like Yarrick Kincaid were all pieces of a larger puzzle.
Wow.
Someone, or some group, was deliberately shaping a conflict that could engulf them both. And the deeper she became involved in ranch life, the more she realized that Silas had been preparing for this kind of storm long before she arrived. In the evenings, Maylin would sit by the fire and listen to Silas recount stories of the land's history, of rival ranchers who had fought over water rights, grazing territory, and old feuds. There were tales of men who disappeared without trace, of confrontations that ended in bloodshed, and of alliances forged in secret beneath the cover of night. "This land," he told her one night, voice low and steady, "has a memory. It doesn't forget who wronged it or who it protected." Mei Lin shivered. The weight of those words made the ranch feel larger, older, and more dangerous than the buildings and fences suggested. The conflict was not only external. Within the ranch, tensions began to rise as Mei Lin discovered rival factions among the workers. Some were loyal to Silas, others cautious and wary of the girl who had suddenly become a figure of authority. A ranch hand named Tobias, broad and muscular, respected Silas but openly questioned Mei Lin's presence. "She's just a girl," he muttered one evening, his gaze hard. "Doesn't matter what you give her. This place isn't safe for someone like her." Mei Lin, though intimidated, refused to retreat. She had learned from Silas that courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to act despite it. Their exchanges grew tense, the quiet undercurrent of challenge, adding another layer to the unfolding story. And then there was Yarrick Kincaid, whose presence became more direct and threatening. Riders from his ranch were spotted near the edges of Silas's land, sometimes moving in the night, sometimes watching from a distance. Silas warned Mei Lin to remain inside the house after dusk, yet she felt compelled to watch, to understand who was circling them and why. On one moonlit night, she saw the glint of metal a rifle resting on a ridge, aimed carefully toward the open fields below. The awareness that someone was not only observing but planning made her stomach tighten. Amidst these tensions, Mei Lin also began to discover small joys and quiet victories on the ranch. She trained the horses, learned to mend the fences herself, and even found the courage to ride alone across stretches of the property. Each success built her confidence, yet each triumph was shadowed by the sense that danger was never far behind. And every time she thought she had a moment of peace, a new threat or the hint of one would appear, reminding her that the West was a place where nothing came easy, and no gift was without consequence. Silas, in his own way, prepared her for what was to come. He taught her how to read the signs of the land, the way the wind shifted over the grasses, the subtle tracks of animals and men, the distant echo of hooves that did not belong to his cattle. Mei Lin began to see the ranch not just as a home, but as a living entity with its own defenses and weaknesses. And with every lesson, every shared glance and wordless exchange, a bond grew between the girl and the man who had given her a world she could barely imagine. Yet even as they fortified the ranch and honed their skills, the tension simmered beyond their fences. News from Dry Creek hinted at growing unrest, with whispers of rival ranchers and outlaws who saw opportunity in Mei Lin's unusual position. Letters slipped under doors, cattle found wounded or missing, and the occasional distant fire suggested that someone was testing them, probing for weakness. Every incident was calculated, deliberate, a reminder that in the West, power and survival were never guaranteed. Mei Lin began to understand that the conflict surrounding the ranch was larger than a single feud or grudge. It was a collision of histories, ambitions, and secrets that had been buried beneath the prairie for decades. She thought often of the auction where her life had changed, of the $3 that had purchased her fate, and of Silas's quiet strength. In that reflection, she felt both gratitude and unease. Gratitude for the chance to live, to learn, to grow. Unease for the storm that had already begun forming beyond the horizon, a storm that neither of them could yet control. One late afternoon, a rider arrived at the ranch, carrying news from distant neighbors. His face was drawn, and his eyes carried the urgency of someone who had seen danger firsthand. He spoke of Yarrick Kincaid's moves, of rustlers gathering near the North Ridge, and of a plan that could put the entire region at risk. Silas listened quietly, jaw tight, eyes narrowing. Mei Lin felt her pulse quicken. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was far darker than she had imagined. As night fell over Granger Ranch, the wind carried a restless energy. Shadows stretched across the fences, across the hills, across the fields, where cattle grazed unaware. Mei Lin stood by the porch, looking out into the darkness, sensing that the events to come would test everything she had learned, the skills, the courage, and the bond with Silas. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard the faintest echo of hooves, deliberate and patient, a reminder that the West always had its watchers, and that the story of a girl, a rancher, and the land they now shared was far from over. The night held its breath, and Malin understood that every choice, every action, and every moment of courage would soon be demanded of her. And in the quiet, dark heart of the prairie, the shadow of Yarick Kincaid and the unknown forces moving beyond the horizon waited, patient and unyielding, for the story to unfold. The wind carried a restless chill. As dusk settled over Granger Ranch, Malin rode along the northern ridge, scanning the horizon where the shadows of hills stretched long and threatening. The evening light painted the plains in shades of amber and steel, and every movement of the prairie seemed amplified, the rustle of grass, the distant call of a hawk, the low whisper of the wind through the fence posts. Malin's heart beat steadily, but beneath it was the thrum of anticipation. She had learned to trust the land, but tonight something told her that danger was closer than the hills suggested. Silas had been unusually quiet all day, moving through the ranch with a careful intensity. He checked the fences twice, inspected the stock, and even rode the perimeter alone, leaving Malin to follow on the trails he had marked. Each action carried an unspoken warning. Someone was coming, and they were calculating every move before making it. Malin had begun to understand that this was no ordinary threat. Yarick Kincaid's presence loomed like a dark cloud over the plains, and Silas's instincts, honed by years in the unforgiving West, left no room for complacency. That evening, the first sign appeared, a flicker of movement in the distant valley, subtle but deliberate. Malin spotted it from the ridge, a figure mounted on a dark horse, riding along the lower trail where cattle often grazed. She tensed, gripping the reins, and Silas, arriving moments later, gave a curt nod. "Kincaid's men," he said quietly. "They're scouting, testing our patience, our reaction. This isn't just threats anymore. They want to know what we'll risk to defend this land." The tension tightened like a bowstring. Malin and Silas watched the figure from the ridge, noting how the rider moved with precision, stopping at intervals to survey the ranch, signaling to others unseen in the twilight. Every instinct Silas had honed over decades screamed caution. The ranch, beautiful and wide as it was, had vulnerabilities, and they were now exposed. Malin felt a cold edge to the air, as though the land itself was warning her of the storm coming. Inside the house, the firelight cast long shadows. Malin and Silas pored over maps and notes, tracing the lines of possible approaches, imagining the maneuvers of men who had no regard for life beyond their own ambitions. Tobias, the skeptical ranch hand, joined them reluctantly, his broad face drawn with concern. "They won't just scare us off," he said. "They'll try to take something. And they'll come at night, when the land's dark and quiet." Silas nodded, his eyes never leaving the maps. "We'll be ready," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. There was a weight in the silence that settled over the room, a knowledge that even preparation could only do so much against the forces moving beyond the ridge. Night fell like a curtain over the ranch, thick and absolute. Malin stayed close to Silas, the crackle of the fire her only comfort against the growing darkness outside. The wind shifted, carrying with it scents of dust, smoke, and horses. Every sound seemed magnified, the groan of a timber, the low murmur of cattle, the faint scraping of rocks against hooves. Each movement sent her heart racing, and each glance at Silas reminded her that they were no longer merely caretakers of a ranch. They were defenders, guardians of a fragile peace on a land that could be taken with one misstep. Hours passed, and the tension only grew. Suddenly, the distant echo of hooves broke the stillness. Malin stiffened, and Silas was already at the window, eyes sharp, hand brushing the worn leather of his revolver. Tobias moved beside them, muscles coiled, ready. The sound grew nearer, deliberate, measured, a rhythm that spoke of intent rather than accident. The ranch was awake now, alert in ways it had never been before, each creak and whisper of the night magnified by the anticipation of what was coming. Then the figures appeared, silhouettes against the horizon, riding hard across the prairie toward the northern fence. Malin felt the ground tremble beneath the pounding hooves. The riders were precise, disciplined more than rustlers, more than ordinary thieves. They had strategy, and their eyes were trained on the ranch as if it were a target marked long ago. Silas moved quickly, barking instructions to Tobias in the other hands, while Malin mounted her horse, heart hammering but mind sharp. This was the moment she had feared and prepared for, the the culmination of weeks of tension and uncertainty. The riders approached cautiously at first, testing the ranch's defenses. Silas met them at the fence, his revolver drawn, voice steady but firm. "This land isn't yours," he called across the distance. "Turn back, or you'll find out why we don't tolerate trespassers." There was a pause, long enough to feel the weight of the night pressing down, and then one of the riders spoke, voice clear and cutting. "Granger, we know the girl is yours now, but gifts like hers come with debts. We're here to collect." Maylin's heart sank at the words, and Silas's jaw tightened. This was no ordinary threat, it was a message, a declaration that the forces surrounding them were personal, precise, and merciless. Maylin felt a surge of fear, but also something near resolve. She had come to the ranch as a girl who had been sold, and now she was a participant in the defense of a life she had fought to understand. The stakes had never been higher. Over the next hours, the tension escalated. The riders circled the ranch, testing gaps in the fencing, signaling to one another with silent gestures. Silas and his team moved like shadows, reinforcing weak points, keeping watch from elevated positions. Maylin found herself assigned to the lookout, perched on a ridge with a clear view of the valley below. Every flicker of movement, every glint of metal, set her pulse racing. The night was alive with threat, each second stretching longer, heavier, until anticipation became a tangible thing that pressed against her chest. As midnight approached, a sudden disturbance erupted at the far corral. A group of riders charged, intent on cutting the cattle free, a classic tactic to draw defenders into vulnerability. Maylin's instincts kicked in. She raised the alarm, and Silas's voice carried across the fields, commanding, directing, warning. Horses snorted, cattle panicked, and the first shots rang out, sharp and echoing. The chaos of the moment was terrifying, yet exhilarating in its intensity. Maylin realized how far she had come, her hands steady, her eyes sharp, her mind focused. She was no longer the girl who had arrived at the auction. She was a part of the ranch, part of its defense, part of the story unfolding under the stars. The battle of shadows and strategy continued through the night. Riders tested the perimeter, Silas countered with precision, and Maylin moved like a ghost along the ridge, guiding the team, signaling threats, and keeping watch over the land she now called home. Every move mattered, every decision carried consequence, and every heartbeat was tied to survival. The night became a symphony of tension, strategy, and courage, each element sharpening the other, driving toward a moment yet unseen but inevitable. In the stillness between clashes, Maylin thought of the auction of the $3 that had changed her life. She thought of Silas, whose quiet strength had shaped her understanding of courage and loyalty. She thought of the land, vast and unyielding, and of the invisible forces gathering beyond the horizon. And she realized that the storm approaching the ranch was not only external, it was testing her, shaping her, transforming her into someone capable of facing what was coming. As the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, the ranch lay in tense anticipation. Riders were still visible, lingering at the edges of the property, observing, waiting for weakness. Silas, Tobias, and Maylin had weathered the night, but the sense of climax, the inevitability of confrontation, hung over them like a cloud ready to burst. Every shadow held possibility, every sound was a warning, and the quiet of the early morning carried a heavier weight than the chaos of the night. Maylin stood on the ridge, looking out over the vast expanse of Granger Ranch, feeling both fear and determination. The lessons of the land of Silas's guidance, her own growing courage, had prepared her for this. But preparation did not remove uncertainty. The coming confrontation promised answers, challenges, and revelations. Yet its outcome remained hidden, waiting for the moment when courage, strategy, and destiny would collide. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of dust and danger. From the far horizon, the figures of Yarrak Kincaid's riders watched, patient, deliberate, and deadly. The story of a girl bought for $3 of a ranch given as a gift, and of the man who had seen something worth protecting in her, was approaching its turning point. Maylin knew as the sun rose over the plains that the storm had not yet broken, but it would, and when it did, nothing about Granger Ranch or their lives would ever be the same. The land waited, Silas waited, and Maylin waited, each aware that the final act was near. And somewhere in the distance, The quiet thrum of hooves carried a promise of reckoning. A tension that would demand courage, strategy, and the strength of bonds forged under the wide, unforgiving sky. The first light of morning broke over Granger Ranch like a promise. The sky was streaked with gold and amber, and the wind carried a quiet, reassuring calm across the prairie. Maylin stood on the ridge, her gaze sweeping over the land she had come to know as home. The night's tension had faded, leaving behind a heavy sense of anticipation, tempered now by a fragile hope. The riders of Yara Kincaid were gone, retreating toward the distant hills where they would reconsider their approach. For the first time in weeks, the ranch felt whole, as if the land itself had sighed in relief. Silas approached silently, his boots crunching against the dry soil. He stopped beside Maylin and surveyed the horizon with his piercing gaze. "They'll be back," he said softly, but there was no fear in his tone, only measured certainty. "They'll test us again eventually, but tonight proved one thing. This land and those who defend it aren't easily taken." Maylin nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Protection of a home, of life itself, was a battle fought every day. And victory, even temporary, was earned with courage, strategy, and trust. The ranch hands emerged from the barn, their faces lined with exhaustion, but also relief. Tobias, who had once doubted Maylin, approached her, his expression softer than it had ever been. "I underestimated you," he admitted, tipping his hat. "You've got grit, girl, more than I expected." Maylin allowed herself a small smile. It was a rare acknowledgement of her growth, a sign that she had found her place among those who had once questioned her presence. Every task she had completed, every lesson learned, had prepared her for this moment, not just survival, but recognition of her strength. As the day progressed, the ranch returned to its rhythms. Cattle were fed, fences repaired, and the horses moved freely across the open land. Maylin found herself riding alongside Silas, feeling a connection to both him and the land that had been unimaginable just weeks before. "You've changed, Maylin," he said quietly, as they guided a group of cattle through a narrow pass. "Not just in skill, but in how you see this place. You understand it now, in ways most never will." She glanced at him, sensing the pride beneath his reserved words. It was rare for Silas to voice emotion, and even rarer for it to be personal. She felt honored, and the acknowledgement filled her with quiet confidence. Despite the calm, there were reminders that life on the frontier demanded vigilance. From the edge of the hills, distant dust clouds hinted at riders in the distance, perhaps scouts, perhaps travelers unaware of the ranch's recent defense. Silas kept his distance at first, observing, calculating, before easing back into the rhythm of the day. Maylin watched him, learning that patience could be as powerful as action. The land itself seemed to reinforce the lesson. Life here required both courage and the wisdom to know when to act and when to wait. Over the next weeks, the story of the Granger Ranch spread through Dry Creek. The townsfolk who had once whispered about Maylin and her sudden ownership now regarded her with respect. They spoke of the girl who had faced danger alongside Silas Granger, who had defended a ranch against men who thought themselves unstoppable. Some came to visit, offering help, supplies, or simply curiosity, while others remained distant, cautious but impressed. The balance of fear and admiration marked the frontier in ways that made every interaction a subtle negotiation of trust. Maylin began to take on new responsibilities at the ranch, exploring opportunities she had never imagined. She handled the accounts, organized supply trips to town, and even mediated small disputes among the hands. Each task carried its own challenges, but each reinforced her connection to the land, to Silas, and to the legacy she had been entrusted with. The gift of the ranch had become more than shelter or property. It was a platform for growth, resilience, and leadership. One afternoon, a messenger arrived from a neighboring settlement, carrying news of Yara Kincaid's retreat and an offer of truce. Silas listened quietly as the man spoke, his face unreadable. When the messenger left, Silas turned to Maylin. "They've decided this fight isn't worth the cost for now, but know this, the West never forgets. And some debts linger longer than others." Maylin nodded, feeling both relief and the lingering sense of caution he had instilled in her. Survival was more than defending land, it was anticipating the moves of those who would challenge it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the plains in fire and shadow, Maylin found herself sitting by the porch, watching Silas move through the yard, tending to horses and cattle with his usual care. Tobias joined them, carrying a bundle of supplies, and for a brief moment, the three of them were silent, sharing a quiet victory. Maylin realized that the true strength of the ranch lay not in fences or gates, but in the bonds forged through shared trials and trust. The land was a witness to courage, and courage in turn shaped the land itself. In the quiet that followed, Maylin reflected on her journey. From the auction, the moment $3 had changed her life, to the nights of tension and the battles fought under stars and moonlight, every step had brought her here. She thought of the lessons learned of resilience, strategy, vigilance, and courage, and understood that her growth had been as much internal as external. She was no longer simply a girl given a ranch. She was a part of its story, its heartbeat, and its future. Silas approached her, settling into the chair beside her with the same quiet calm he had always carried. "You've done well, Maylin," he said, voice low but steady. "More than well. You've proven yourself, not just to me, but to this land. You're a part of it now, and it's a part of you." Maylin looked at him, understanding the depth of what he said. Words could not capture the gratitude and respect she felt, but she knew that in the silence between them, it was understood. The ranch, the land, the trials they had created, something stronger than either of them alone. As the sun set, the prairie stretched out in quiet majesty. Cattle moved lazily across the fields, horses nickered softly, and the wind whispered through the tall grasses. Maylin felt a sense of completion, a rare, calm understanding that the storm had passed and the land was theirs to nurture. But even with victory, there was humility. The West, she realized, demanded respect, courage, and constant vigilance. Success was never permanent. It was earned, protected, and honored. Over the following days, life returned to a new rhythm. The ranch thrived under the combined efforts of Silas, Maylin, and the loyal hands who had remained through every challenge. Small triumphs marked each day: cattle safely grazing, fences repaired, horses trained, and a sense of community strengthened. Maylin took pride in these accomplishments, not as possessions, but as proof of what determination and teamwork could achieve. Every act of care, every decision, reinforced the lessons she had learned about courage, responsibility, and leadership. The story of the girl who had been bought for $3 and the rancher who had given her a world, transformed into one of legend in Dry Creek. It was a tale of resilience, courage, and unexpected generosity. Of a young woman finding strength she had never known, and a man whose quiet wisdom shaped more than land, it shaped lives. The narrative carried lessons beyond the borders of the ranch, whispered from neighbor to neighbor about the value of courage, loyalty, and trust. One warm evening, as the horizon glowed with the colors of sunset, Maylin stood at the fence, looking across the fields she now called her own. Silas approached, handing her a weathered hat, a gesture of trust and partnership. "You've earned this," he said simply. And Maylin understood that the gift of the ranch was now a shared journey, one that would continue with growth, challenges, and discovery. She tipped the hat, a small smile curving her lips, and felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the steady confidence of someone who had faced fear, adversity, and uncertainty, and had emerged stronger. The prairie seemed to stretch forever, a living testament to the trials they had faced and the victories won. Horses grazed calmly, cattle moved peacefully, and the wind carried the promise of continued prosperity. The land was alive, shaped by courage, loyalty, and determination, and Maylin felt its heartbeat as keenly as her own. She knew that life on the frontier demanded resilience, but it also offered reward, the kind that could only come to those willing to face danger, embrace responsibility, and grow beyond what they believed possible. As night fell over Granger Ranch, the stars emerged, clear and bright against the vast canvas of sky. Maylin and Silas stood side by side, looking out over the land. The past had been turbulent, the threats real and relentless, but the present held clarity, strength, and hope. The story that had begun with $3, an auction, and an unlikely gift now unfolded into one of courage, resilience, and enduring partnership. And under the quiet sweep of the prairie night, Granger Ranch stood as a testament not only to the land's beauty and danger, but to the human spirit capable of shaping destiny, protecting what mattered most, and embracing life with unwavering resolve. The ranch was quiet, the horizon still glowing with the last light of day. Maylin understood that her life had been irrevocably changed, and yet for the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, purpose, and peace. The lessons learned, the challenges faced, and the victories earned were hers to carry forward, along with the land, the legacy, and the bond with Silas Granger. Granger Ranch was more than a home, it was proof that courage, trust, and determination could create a future brighter than any shadow the past could cast.